Hello and welcome back to Sustainable AF. In this first series, we're taking you on a guided tour of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, a framework designed to help us build a more sustainable future.
I'm Felicia. I'm an author and entrepreneur, and I teach about climate change and energy transition at the University of London.
I'm Alex. I'm an ex-finance guy who is now focused on a regenerative agriculture startup, which I'm really excited to talk about later.
This week, we're going to be discussing SDG 14, and that's life on land. Last week, we took a closer look at a massive SDG that was life below water, which was highlighting the interlinkages between ocean health, biodiversity loss, and climate change, as well as the many issues that need to be addressed. And to be honest, life on land isn't that much different. The issues are many and varied, except this time we're talking about our homes, communities, and ecosystems. The important thing to remember is that society is built on and in nature and ecosystem services. We wouldn't be here without them.
Land-based ecosystems, which make up roughly 30% of the planet's surface, provide us with sources of water, food, fuel, shelter, and medicine. It also helps us to mitigate carbon emissions, as well as adapt to the impact of a changing climate. More than 1.6 billion people directly depend on forest biodiversity and ecosystem services for their livelihoods. At the same time, the health of those ecosystems underpin everything which we consume.
The things we need to deal with are actually things like addressing species and habitat extinctions. They're often driven by habitat conversion, and that's largely due to agriculture. At the same time, we have to address climate change, pollution, unsustainable exploitation, and invasive species. And then we've got the fact that climate change itself is threatening ecosystems, water quality, habitat and biodiversity, which again in turn reduces existing resilience to climate change.
As Fee said, a bit like our last SDG on the oceans, if we don't sort this out, we are pretty screwed. Now, SDG 15 relates to so many of the other goals: number 2, 3, 7, 6, 8, 11, 12, and 13.
It's a whole bunch of stuff. It's the provision of goods, of the raw materials we use for construction, for the things that we make energy from, and obviously for food.
Ecosystem services, including the capture of carbon, maintenance of soil quality, provision of habitat for biodiversity, maintenance of water quality, as well as the regulation of water flow and erosion control. Therefore, contributing to the reduction of risks of natural disasters such as floods and landslides.
So we also know that the ecosystem regulates climate. It's about maintaining the productivity of our agricultural systems and those systems which support mitigation and adaptation. More than half the world's economic output, that's an estimated 44 trillion of economic value generation, is actually moderately or highly dependent on nature. And that's according to the latest estimates from the World Economic Forum. But already humanity's wiped out 83% of wild mammals and half of all plants. 3/4 of ice-free land and 2/3 of marine environment have already been severely altered by the actions of the human race.
The high dependency of the global economy on nature means nature loss represents significant risk to corporate and financial stability. Nature loss poses material risk and opportunity for the financial sector, and the risks of inaction are frankly immense. In its 2020 Global Risk Report, the World Economic Forum ranked biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse as one of the top 5 risks over the next 10 years. But the opportunity from actions are equally huge. Action for nature-positive transition could generate up to $10 trillion annually in business value and create 395 million jobs by 2030. But first of all, we have to work out where the problems lie and what we can do about it.
Okay, so there are some basic things we need to talk about when we're talking about life on land. Ecosystem services and our reliance on nature, biodiversity, that thing that keeps ecosystems functioning. We need to talk about forestry, deforestation, and desertification. And then it's things like rewilding, and of course, most importantly, agriculture and food.
The amazing thing is that the international community signed treaties to combat desertification and the loss of biodiversity when they signed the Framework Convention on Climate Change back at the Earth Summit in 1992. But it's only now, as we're beginning to understand how interconnected all these different systems are, that we're beginning to see biodiversity and our reliance on nature as part of the mainstream conversation.
So we know that nature is critical to our survival. It provides us with our oxygen. It regulates our weather patterns and pollinates our crops. It produces our food, feed, and fibre. But the thing is, it's under increasing stress. Human activities altered almost 75% of the Earth's surface so far, squeezing out wildlife and nature into an ever smaller corner of the planet.
Luckily, the most recent reports argue that it's not too late to make a difference, but only if we start now, at every level, from local to global. Through transformative change, nature can still be conserved, restored, and used sustainably. This is also key to meeting most of the other global goals. By transformative change, we mean a fundamental, system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, and social factors, including paradigms, goals, and values.
So just to get a clearer idea of quite how bad things are today, the 2019 Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services lays out where we stand. So I've mentioned 75% of terrestrial environment has been severely altered to date. 47% reduction in indicators of ecosystem condition against natural baselines. We've got around 60 billion tonnes a year of renewable and non-renewable resources extracted every year. That's up nearly 100% since 1980. There's been a 15% increase in global per capita consumption of those materials extracted since 1980. And this one just blows my mind. Over 85% of wetlands that existed in 1700 have been lost by the year 2000. That means that the loss of wetlands is currently 3 times faster in percentage terms than forest loss.
And yet no one really talks about it.
Oh, and it's amazing.
But it's not just the ecosystems themselves. The health of our planet and ecosystems also plays an important role in the emergence of zoonotic diseases, i.e. diseases that were transmissible between animals and humans. As we continue to encroach on fragile ecosystems, we bring humans into ever greater contact with wildlife, enabling pathogens in wildlife to spill over to livestock and humans, increasing the risk of disease emergence and amplification. When you look at economic and social impacts of the last pandemic, which is still ongoing, frustratingly, it's clear that something really needs to be done to address this. This doesn't work.
Yeah, so basically where we are, even though there are systems, there are areas that are under protection or under sustainable management, and this has increased over the last few years, the pressure on biodiversity and ecosystems is growing. It's increased exponentially. So scientists have estimated, for example, that we're losing species at a rate at least 1,000 times faster than would happen under natural circumstances.
And, or on the positive, as we've shown throughout this podcast series, aligning economic opportunities with nature can often yield a better result than when fighting against it. But it will take a paradigm shift in focus, a thought path and economic practices that are more aligned with nature rather than going against it. This, of course, is no small ask in the world that we live in, but the opportunity is there to create a cleaner, fairer planet.
Yeah, and the thing is, the way we've grown as human beings has had a really detrimental effect on biodiversity on land because humans and nature are disconnected. There's a lot that humans have got to answer for. We're a weird and wonderful bunch. We've dominated life on Earth in the last few thousand years, mainly due to our enlarged brains and our ability to manage social constructs. But what we don't seem to have developed is any sense of balance.
So next, that brings us on to deforestation and desertification. Sustaining life on land means preserving and restoring terrestrial biodiversity and ecosystems such as forests, wetlands, grasslands, drylands, and mountains by halting deforestation, fragmentation, and overgrazing. Reversing desertification and land degradation is key. We have lost over 130 million hectares of rainforest since 1990.
Most of this has been driven by a combination of human activity and climate change, posing major challenges to sustainable development and affecting the lives and livelihoods of millions of people. We lose more than 12 million hectares of land every year to drought and desertification, which, if we managed it more sustainably, could apparently produce about 20 million tonnes of grain. That's enough to feed 40 million people for a year.
At the same time, we need to replenish our soils. The Earth's soil provides over $16 trillion worth of ecosystem services each year. And remember that forests make the soil and then protect the soil, keeping it from sliding off rock when it rains. Trees protect crops, hold water, make clouds and rain. We wouldn't have the Earth as we know it without forests.
So I think we've made it very clear that forests are vitally important for sustaining life on Earth, as well as playing a major role in the fight against climate change. So they're important habitats for life. They're a resource for timber, plants, and medicine. I don't know if you know this, but 3/4 of the top commercial prescription drugs around the world contain components that come from plants. And obviously, forests provide us with oxygen to breathe. It's not for nothing the Amazon rainforest has been called the planet's lungs.
Absolutely. And on top of that, forests are an important carbon sink as they sequester carbon. But the relationship is complicated, and just planting more trees doesn't establish the complex ecosystems that ancient forests have. When forests grow, carbon is removed from the atmosphere and absorbed in the wood, leaves, and soil. Because forests and oceans can absorb and store carbon over an extended period of time, they are considered carbon sinks. The carbon remains stored in the forest ecosystem, but can be released into the atmosphere when the forest is burnt or cut down. Quantifying the substantial role of forests in absorbing, storing, and releasing carbon is key to understanding the global carbon cycle and hence solving climate change.
So again, it's really quite clear that investing in land restoration is going to be critical for improving livelihoods, reducing vulnerabilities, and reducing overall risks for the economy. If you think about this, between 1998 and 2013, about 20% of cultivated land showed persistent and declining trends in productivity, placing the lives of 1 billion people under threat. Keeping that soil healthy is critical, and that brings us to the issue of agriculture.
The UN has said we only have 60 cycles of current agricultural production left if we keep cultivating the land in the way that we currently do. Now, the world has a lot of mouths to feed. Just 100 years ago, the global population was approximately 1.8 billion. The United Nations estimates that of June 2021, the global population is now 7.9 billion people. Commercial farming, as it was developed in the 20th century, has been remarkably successful, and it has carried us this far, but there has been a price to pay, and we are near the limits of what it can do. Now is the time to rethink how we feed our world.
So just to get an idea of where we are, Alex and I have put together some stats that just give you an idea of where we are in the world in terms of food, agricultural production. So, for example, we've seen a 300% increase in food crop production since 1970. 100 million. That's the number of hectares of agricultural expansion in the tropics from 1980 to 2000. To be honest, that's mostly cattle ranching in Latin America, which has been around 42 million hectares, and plantations in Southeast Asia, which is around 7.5 million. And 80% of that is palm oil, half of it at the expense of forests. One of the things that Alex has always said to me, though, when it comes to this kind of thing. It's not the cow, it's the how. So the practices of how you actually look after your cattle and how you grow your sources, this is a hugely important part of how it works.
And not cutting down the forest to graze them. Makes no sense. 3% increase in land transformation to agriculture between 1992 and 2015. Mostly, again, at the expense of forest.
So what's the real challenge in all of this is that the most developed business models and production processes are about extraction. They're about making the most amount of money in the cheapest possible way. One of the things that's happening at the moment is these processes, the destructive nature of them, has highlighted the fact that we need to do things differently. And there's a movement underway around the world called regenerative agriculture. And that's about focusing on how we improve soils, how we manage land, how we manage animals. And this can have a multitude of benefits to both businesses and the valued supply chain of food production, as well as a positive climate benefit as it actually helps to sequester carbon.
Regenerative land use and food production is an amazing solution to climate, health, social issues, as well as farmers' bottom lines. And I'm literally putting my money where my mouth is. I met Fee when I was doing my master's at SOAS, and we covered a number of transition themes, including renewable energy, electrical transport, decarbonisation of manufacturing, and cyclical economies. But by far, the most interesting to me were nature-based solutions and regenerative business models. Whilst researching the agricultural sector, it's become apparent how severely underutilised the land is, suffering from an unprofitable, subsidy-driven model which is in need of a paradigm shift. With 212,000 farms in the UK, covering over 9 million hectares, the opportunity is huge to return farming to nature-based solutions, therefore regenerative agriculture. My model and my business has 3 different components. That's a transition finance fund, a data-driven consultancy business, and a path to market for produce that trades at a premium for its regenerative eco label. On top of the fact that this farming method is more profitable, the process has the added benefit of sequestering carbon, and the carbon market opportunity here is yet to be fully realised, but it's huge. I did find myself, whilst researching this, questioning why regenerative agriculture is not used nationwide as a standard, given all these benefits. The largest barrier I found to regenerative agricultural practices is the time it takes to regain soil health, and therefore the financial implications it has, and the knowledge gap of how to farm regeneratively, given the way things are taught and practiced in this sector. And this is the hole that I'm trying to plug with my business.
And you see, I've got an answer for why regenerative practices aren't necessarily used nationwide. And that's because soil health, forests, ecosystem and biodiversity values are not internalised by the markets. They're seen as externalities. That means that the cost of biodiversity and ecosystem loss is not reflected in price. We've talked about this in previous pods, about the lack of inclusion of externalities in economic operations. Instead, companies are simply taking advantage of the common goods that we all share, be that air, water or land.
And the writing is on the wall. This is changing. We are going to see a carbon tax, or we already have a carbon tax. We are going to see a price on biodiversity. Similarly, public budgets often overlook the economic potential and negative risks associated with underfunding biodiversity and conservation. Average biodiversity expenditure as a share of total government expenditure range from as low as 0.16% to just 1.8%, according to the Biodiversity Finance Initiative.
So what's really clear is greater investments are needed to maintain, protect and restore the Earth's valuable biodiversity and ecosystem services. As Alex said, we've got a carbon tax, but what we're expecting to see in the next few years is some kind of pricing mechanism for these services. The cost is immense. So, for example, achieving sustainable forest management on a global scale could cost, 70 to 160 billion a year. That's just forestry. There's a further 150 to 450 billion a year just to halt the loss of biodiversity. And to fill this financing gap, countries are going to need to mix private and public finance, domestic and international resources. What they need is to be provided with adequate incentives to change the way they do things, as well as support to join all the global efforts to conserve our shared natural resources.
And frankly, by pricing in these externalities, it gives governments and businesses and civic societies the roadmap and framework they need to align with nature rather than just keep going against it. A lot of government action can be taken here too, just like with climate change, where people are demanding government stop coal funding investments. Much could be achieved through increasing public budgets, reform and launches of green taxes, as well as phasing out harmful subsidies and official development assistance.
Now, internationally, ODA is really important because it plays a role in catalysing and crowding in private finance, especially in conservation. And that makes up a tiny part of financial markets. Success in attracting private capital to conservation through green bonds or impact investment vehicles could actually help transform the financing landscape for SDG 15. The trouble with ODA at the moment is it's international finance. And of course, in the UK, the government's just cut ODA to its lowest point. So I think at the moment they're suggesting they're going to invest 0.5% of GDP. So it may be a while before we can help. You know, we understand there's a need to recover from COVID, but at the same time, cutting investment that will help protect the health of the ecosystem is not necessarily the best way to protect long-term against disease. What really matters, though, is that it's the right vehicles that are made ready for investment.
Absolutely, Fee. And mechanisms and strategies are numerous. We've got debt for nature swaps, where creditors forego receiving a portion of its debt repayments on the condition that they are invested in ecological projects and can be revamped. Pricing mechanisms such as payment for ecosystem services provide incentives for communities to preserve and manage natural assets and can then be multiplied and scaled up. Ecological fiscal transfer can introduce conservation indices, i.e. the size and quality of protected areas, as part of the fiscal allocation formula to reward investments in conservation.
Now, some of this stuff might sound really technical, but it's just trying to get people to think in a different way about how you use capital to change what people do. So the Biodiversity Finance Initiative has come up with a range of financial mechanisms that could actually help fund potential solutions. We've got an incredibly long list. We'll run through a few of them. And obviously, if you're interested, let us know and we can go into more detail. One of the most obvious ones is biodiversity offsets. Now, that's about measurable outcomes from taking actions compensating for adverse biodiversity impacts. For example, those that come from development projects.
Next one, bioprospecting. A systematic search for biochemical and genetic information in nature in order to develop commercial viable products and applications. This biomimicry is really interesting and important.
Another one that's really obvious is this idea of concessions or protected areas. And actually that allows people to use land or property in a protected area or a natural site for a very specific purpose, usually in exchange for a fee. One of the things we have to be careful about, though, is this is very political. So, for example, under the Trump administration, some protected areas were opened up for oil drilling. So, you have to understand the limits of any of the mechanisms you use.
Next one is a great one, crowdfunding. This is a way to approach project organization and entrepreneurs with startups to raise money for their cause from multiple individual donors and investors.
Another one is actually enterprise challenge funds. So that's actually a funding instrument that gives grants or some kind of concessional finance to profit-seeking projects that perhaps won't make as much profit as an alternative because it's about protecting ecosystems.
The next one is green bonds and impact investing. In specifically an EIB, which is an environmental impact bond. You've got investors that want to have ESG outcomes and you've got farmers that can give ecological outcomes. Put those two together, it's a wonderful mix of pushing ecological outcomes.
One of the ones we've referred to earlier is payment for ecosystem services. And that's when a beneficiary or a user of an ecosystem service makes a direct or indirect payment to the provider of that service. This has worked really well in Costa Rica, where coffee farmers are actually paid to protect forests.
The next one, which is obviously a really big one, is taxes, taxes, taxes. We've got taxes on things that have negative externalities, such as pesticides, chemical fertilizers, deforestation, or unsustainable deforestation. And then you've got taxing positive externalities at a lower rate, renewable energy, natural capital, those sort of things. Pay companies to do good things, tax them to do bad things.
And then the final one is standards. And this often starts out voluntary and ends up becoming mandatory as the market shifts. But this is the idea that you change the way in which the financial sector values the performance of a company, the operations of a company. So it sort of rewards those companies that capture good practices, and it encourages the achievement and the monitoring of social and environmental outcomes. So that brings us to this idea of the types of solutions we're looking for. And the first one is this market shift. This idea that reporting and transparency can really transform the way things work. Let's not forget that while the last couple of years have seen a significant shift in market expectation, a lot of this has been driven by the work of the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, known as the TCFD. That was what helped to financialize climate risk in the eyes of investors. What we've now got is the Task Force for Nature-Related Disclosures, or the TNFD, which has been announced, and it should be operational by 2022. If it follows the same path as TCFD, as investors and corporations become more aware of the potential risk of ignoring our relationship with nature, then reporting and investor demands will drive action. Not those distant targets that make us all cry greenwash, but actually clear, accountable, time-bound actions that show we're moving towards a new relationship with nature.
Absolutely, and that's super exciting. Looking at technology, there are technology solutions, from the most basic improvements to irrigation to new technologies that allow for seeds to be planted with pods that provide water and for the first few months of growth. There are other areas too, which we can talk about in the next series, but satellite imaging is a massive, plays a massive role in tracking deforestation and reforestation projects.
Sure. So then there's satellites also can do things like tracking poaching and other hunting for profit issues that can be addressed. And it's not just satellites. You know, there's drone technology for land management. Again, drones that can check what's going on in particular land. But that's a market estimated to already be around 100 billion a year. The opportunities for technology to solve problems while making a profit are enormous.
AI can be used for scan for weeds, reducing the need for chemical sprays by 95%.
It's just amazing. There's the idea that images, you can tell the difference between a weed and a crop and alter your chemical spray so that it only touches the weeds.
Shout out to the small robot company who are doing exactly that.
Very, very cool. But then there's things like mobile solutions. We've talked in other pods about, access to credit and to bank accounts through the mobile phone. But it's also a way of tracking land rights and providing some kind of framework where you can actually support local and indigenous land rights and protections. Technology is very cool.
It is. But so are humans. Humans are intrinsically linked to the earth and the peace it brings. It is a powerful tool to help humanity. It may sound a bit ethereal, but it's true. We don't just need technological solutions. We need people to wake up and smell the roses when it comes to nature.
One way you can actually talk about this is just thinking about the fact that nature has the power to heal itself if we don't keep exploiting it. That's what rewilding is all about. Restoring ecosystems to a point where nature can take care of itself and restoring our relationship with the natural world. That means reconnecting with what matters, living in nature, not on it. the valuing of natural assets, pollination valuation. What we're talking about is the fact that our relationship with nature must change. Let's be honest, to meet the food production demands of the growing world population, for most of the 20th century, agriculture has been focused on controlling nature, on subduing it. We need to turn that around and work with nature to increase biodiversity, to keep enriching the soil and improving our watersheds. We need to reduce the need for tilling and commercial fertilizer. And we actually, we need to keep and increase carbon in the soil, capturing new carbon in above ground biomass. And actually that will help make agriculture part of the solution to GHG emissions rather than what is a really big contributory part of the problem.
What Fee's touching on there is regenerative agriculture practices. And it is a complete win-win-win model. Agriculture is a natural fit for regenerative practices, but regenerative business models and economics can be applied to other industries.
So I find this really interesting. And actually, Alex, I want you to just talk me through this one, because I know you came across this great thinker who talks about the paradigm and how that can work. And it's a guy called Ethan Soloviev.
Yeah, so he talks about regenerative practices or regenerative economics as a continuum. There is no point A to point B that's done. That's kind of how we look at economic processes now, and it's ended up in the place that we have. It's a continual state of improvement along this continuum, and it's a really nice concept.
And that sort of brings us to this idea of the circular economy. In a sense, regenerative practices are one step beyond. But even though for many of us, the circular economy seems like this really obvious solution, we're still developing ways that companies can get comfortable with that. What we have to understand is that things like corporate social responsibility, even commitments to sustainability, they have failed to change the course of an extractive economy. Businesses haven't succeeded in continually adding value to all of their stakeholders. And that means customers and co-creators and communities and investors and the earth itself. If we're going to achieve the change that we want to see, we need to think more deeply about the purpose of business. What's it there for? Are companies there to service their customers, or are we in service to their wants and needs? We've got to drive regenerative and inclusive growth where all of us can thrive in harmony with nature.
Our podcast is focused around a framework that we feel is really important and well thought through. That's obviously why we did a podcast to explore its merits. The most important of which is about focusing on the system as a whole, and we need to look across silos. The idea is that the SDG indicators can work as a foundation for a new global framework of understanding and accountability of our actions.
What's become really apparent to us, though, as we've looked through all these SDGs and looked at companies and looked at technologies, is that we need to look to what's next, not just about sustainability, but about recovery, about replenishment and the regeneration of natural, social, and economic systems. Our research again and again has flagged up that we need to build on things that are already out there. Things like donut economics, our knowledge of planetary boundaries, and the circular business models that price in externality costs. That means we need to look towards regenerative economics and business models as our roadmap forward.
Totally. We're not just trying to pick something out of the air here. We have the pieces of the puzzle in front of us already happening. It's about putting them together. Now, as ever, we've cantered through one of the most complicated goals at a rapid rate, but we hope it's given you something to think about. Catch up with us on Instagram, and if you're interested in what we say, like us, rate us, and subscribe.
So next week, we're going to be talking about SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. So we hope you'll join us next week as we continue on our journey to becoming sustainable AF.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.